Greetings fellow humans and welcome to the Renaissance Yorkshireman podcast. Today I'd like to expand on some of the ideas I spoke about in my last video related to game theory. So I'm going to be talking more about zero-sum games and non-zero-sum games. And I'm also going to be talking about reciprocal strategies and Machiavellian strategies and different personality types such as the Dark Triad personality type of psychopathy, narcissism and Machiavellianism. Before I get into that, I'd like to first talk a little bit about some of my sources. So one of my sources is The Wisdom of Psychopaths by Professor Kevin Dutton, a very entertaining book and very interesting. The Psychopath Epidemic by Cameron Riley. My own book, The Tao of Sustainable Development, A New Post-Capitalist Paradigm. I have a full chapter on psychopathy in my book. And the other two sources I want to talk about are The 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene, which I think is a superlative work, and also 0 Degrees of Empathy, A New Theory of Kindness and Cruelty by Professor Simon Baron-Cohen. Yesterday I talked about zero-sum games and non-zero-sum games. And today I want to talk a little bit about Machiavellian strategies and reciprocal strategies. So I'll give two examples of reciprocal strategies. So let's say I have a problem with my bathroom. I phone up the plumber says to me, okay, it sounds like it'll take an hour, it's £50 an hour. The plumber comes round, fixes my bathroom in an hour, I give him £50, it's win-win. My bathroom now works properly, the plumber has £50. That's an example which has a financial exchange. Another possible example might be my next door neighbour has a 5-year-old child, needs to do something in town, asks me if I'll babysit for a couple of hours. So I go around and babysit, and in return my neighbour cooks me a meal. So in this case, there is no exchange of money. So reciprocal strategies can involve an exchange of money, but often they don't. As far as I can tell, reciprocal strategies are always, or almost always, there may be some exceptions, non-zero-sum games. So they're expansive games, so primarily win-wins. In contrast, nasty strategies or Machiavellian strategies involve one person gaining or one group gaining at the expense of another group or person. So for example, earlier this week I had to phone my bank because someone attempted to do fraud on my account. So that cyber criminal was trying to steal from me and give me nothing in return. This is a nasty strategy or a Machiavellian strategy. And as far as I can tell, and again there may be exceptions, but as far as I can tell, all nasty strategies, Machiavellian strategies, are zero-sum games. Someone is gaining at the expense of someone else. In this video, I'm going to talk about 3 types of people. So one type is the Dark Triad personality, and that is psychopathy, narcissism and Machiavellianism together. Not all psychopaths are narcissists and not all narcissists are psychopaths, but they do often go together. So this particular group has the negative traits of both psychopaths and narcissists, and we call it the Dark Triad because in addition to their psychopathy and their narcissism, they employ Machiavellian strategies. The second group don't suffer from the Dark Triad personality type, but they are suffering from some form of mental illness, trauma or addiction. And because of this, they sometimes employ strategies which are Machiavellian. And the third type of people are non-Dark Triad and non-sufferers from trauma. And because I don't want to constantly talk about them in the negative, I'm going to refer to them as humane people. But there's probably a better phrase than this, but this is what I came up with and it will suit for now. People who suffer from trauma or mental health issues or some kind of addictive illness, they will have strategies to help them cope with these problems. And the most common short-term strategy, which is often extremely effective, is repression. They push down their trauma and they get on with their life. Now, as I say, this can be an effective strategy in the short term, but as a medium or long-term strategy, it's not a very good strategy, and it will cause them all sorts of problems. So the only real solution in the long term is either to manage their issues or to deal with their issues. Now, according to Dr. Ben Sessa, and I recommend that you view some of his videos on YouTube, that's Sessa, S-E-S-S-A, people who are suffering from trauma, the best treatment for them is psychotherapy in conjunction with MDMA. MDMA on the street is known as E, ecstasy, X, Mandy, other names, but it's a chemical with a lot of amazing properties. And according to Dr. Ben Sessa, it puts people who suffer from trauma in a particular state where they're able to relate to their trauma and discuss it without reliving the trauma. And when they do this, often they can actually deal with their trauma and heal themselves. And according to Dr. Ben Sessa, the cure rate with MDMA in conjunction with psychotherapy is approximately 50 to 60%. And this is a huge cure rate as compared to conventional therapies, which as a general rule have a less than 5% cure rate and are primarily aimed at managing problems rather than curing them. Now, as it happens, MDMA is illegal in the United Kingdom and indeed illegal in most countries. And yet there is so much evidence that it's the best treatment for trauma. So one of the solutions we need to find for dealing with trauma is to legalize or decriminalize MDMA for use in a therapeutic setting. And people who are suffering from trauma, they may sometimes employ Machiavellian strategies and they may sometimes employ reciprocal strategies. But probably the reason that they're employing Machiavellian strategies is quite different from why a narcissist or a psychopath would employ Machiavellian strategies. They're doing it because they're suffering from trauma. And it may in fact be the case that we might need a third category of strategies in game theory to be trauma strategies that people use because they're suffering from trauma. That may or may not be the case. We might need a third category, we might not. I don't know, I'm not a clinical psychologist. So humane people, they have a sense of empathy and their natural default strategy is to employ reciprocal strategies. It may be in some circumstances that they do employ Machiavellian strategies, but that would be because of the particular context they're in and they're not naturally predisposed to Machiavellian strategies, although they may still be quite good at them. But in their general day-to-day life, they're normally employing reciprocal strategies. So non-zero-sum games, expansive strategies that are often win-win situations. According to Professor Simon Baron-Cohen in his book that I mentioned earlier, there are 3 types of people who he identifies as suffering from zero empathy negative. They are psychopaths, narcissists, and people suffering from borderline personality disorder. So people who are suffering from borderline personality disorder, they would fall into the category of people suffering from some kind of trauma, who I've already spoken about, which leaves 2 remaining categories, narcissists and psychopaths. Not all narcissists are psychopaths and not all psychopaths are narcissists. And some people may be asking, what's the difference between a sociopath and a psychopath? As far as I understand it, sociopath is a legal definition, whereas psychopath is a medical definition. So again, sociopath and psychopath often come together, but not always. People who are suffering from the Dark Triad have psychopathy and narcissism, and they employ Machiavellian strategies. What are Machiavellian strategies? Go and read The 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene, and he spells it out. In its essence, what he's saying in his book, at least what I believe he's saying, is in the first instance, there are a finite number of strategies that any human can employ. And I believe that this is related to the size of the brain and particularly the neocortex. So what that would mean is if you were to look at a different group of primates, such as chimpanzees, because they have smaller brains and smaller neocortexes than humans, they would have a smaller number of Machiavellian strategies available to them. And it may be that because they don't have the ability to speak, they have a still smaller number of Machiavellian strategies available to them. And if we continue this thought experiment on the other side and were to imagine an extraterrestrial species which had a larger brain than us and a larger neocortex than human beings, it would then stand to reason that those extraterrestrials would have more Machiavellian strategies available to them. It may be that Robert Greene is incorrect about having 48 strategies. Now, I've read his book and I think it's excellent, and I think the evidence that he puts forward is quite compelling, but he may be wrong. Machiavellian strategies are used to gain at the expense of someone else. If we assume that Robert Greene is in fact correct and there are only 48 strategies, and any Machiavellian strategy that a human is going to employ dealing with other people, it's going to be one of these strategies or some minor variation on this. But logically, this would also mean that there's presumably a finite number of reciprocal strategies available to humans. I've given this issue a certain amount of thought, and I believe that there are probably less reciprocal strategies available to humans than there are Machiavellian strategies. And the reason for this is that Machiavellian strategies are often quite complex and complicated and sometimes convoluted, and often require some form of conspiracy. And this involves a lot more thought process. Now, reciprocal strategies are by their nature simpler, and so I think that it's not necessary to have as many reciprocal strategies because a small number will work extremely well. So if I had to hazard a guess, I would go with somewhere between 12 and 36 reciprocal strategies, but it could be less, it could be more, I don't know. In the case of the Dark Triad personality type, there are presumably different types of Dark Triad personality, but I'm only really going to talk about two. One is the loner type and the other is the group type. So I believe that Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, is a classic example of someone who suffers from the Dark Triad personality type. And on Netflix at the moment, there is a documentary about him. You can watch it yourself. In many respects, they're accepting that sooner or later they will get caught and they will end up either in prison, in a secure mental hospital, or dead. And they are willing to take more risks than would be normal people who don't suffer from the Dark Triad personality type. It's therefore then, if I'm correct with those assumptions and they're evidence-based, if we carry on our logical argument, if you're a Dark Triad personality type and you don't want to get caught and you're willing to get together with other people, it stands to reason that you're going to band together with other people who suffer from the Dark Triad personality type so that it's easier to get away with your nefarious activities and not get put in prison. This raises a number of questions. How many people with the Dark Triad personality type are there? Now, I've read quite a lot about psychopathy, and different writers make different assumptions and propose different numbers. So, for example, Professor Kevin Dutton proposes between about 0.7% and 1% of the general population are clinical psychopaths. There's probably more narcissists than there are psychopaths. Who knows how many? 2 or 3% perhaps. So, if we assume altogether psychopaths individually, narcissists individually, and those who suffer from the Dark Triad of psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism, there's perhaps 3% of the population are this type of personality. Could be slightly more, it could be slightly less. But given that there's 7.5 billion humans on the planet, That could be 200 million people. That is a lot of psychopaths and narcissists. And this is problematic on a number of levels. One of them is when you start to engage with psychopaths or narcissists, as a general rule, whatever strategies you employ, you will lose. Because that's the nature of the games that they play. Another problem is the kinds of professions that psychopaths often prefer. In Professor Dutton's book, The Wisdom of Psychopaths, he talks about the Great British Psychopath Survey that he carried out. Now, this was not scientific research in the way that scientific research is usually carried out. It was more anecdotal. So we can't take this as an exact science, but it's interesting nonetheless. So according to Dutton, the top 10 professions with high psychopathic traits are CEOs, lawyers, media, TV and radio, salespeople, surgeons, journalists, police officers, clerics, chefs and civil servants. I believe that there are 2 professions missing from that list. I would also put in politicians and economists. And it's interesting that on that list we have surgeons, and on the list of the 10 professions that score lowest on the psychopathy checklist is doctors. So what is different about surgeons and doctors? Well, they do the same degree. They do a medical degree in the first instance, and then they're going to specialise in different areas. But a doctor needs to have empathy because they're talking with people on a regular basis. They need a bedside manner, so it helps them to be non-psychopaths. Surgeons, in contrast, are operating in people, and if they have a personal connection with the person they're operating, it might affect their ability to perform surgery. So in the case of surgeons, it can actually be an advantage to have a lack of empathy. So in some professions, it can be helpful to lack empathy, but obviously in many situations, it is an extremely negative trait for humans in general. In my next video, I'm going to expand on some of the ideas. Now, I believe that the individual parts of what I'm talking about related to game theory are not actually massively complex. The thing is, there's so many parts to it that if we put them all together, it does begin to look very complex. But when we take them out individually, the bricks are not so complicated. Thank you for giving me your time today. Peace.